Greetings everyone, this is Ohio Dan. Today's video topic is the red pill and relationship absurdity. And what I mean by that is basically as a follow-up to a video I did this past summer called When You're No Longer Part of the Game. And in that video I talked about how your perspective shifts when you no longer see yourself as being part of the conventional or traditional relationship dynamic. When you realize, for example, that marriage is really not a very good deal for men today. When you realize that if you have kids with a woman, you're kind of just providing her children, and hopefully you can continue to stay in those kids' lives, but the woman is the one that has primary authority over that family because that's just the culture and the legal system that we live in. And I talked about how once you kind of accept that that's where things are, you see things play out around you. You see sort of examples of male and female nature that are not necessarily very healthy in terms of how they actually apply to relationships. And you realize that a lot of the behaviors and actions that people take in order to try to be in or maintain a relationship, a lot of those behaviors are toxic and not really reflecting any sort of actual self-interest or actual attempt to make good choices for yourself. And you can kind of take a step back and look at that more easily when you see yourself outside of that traditional relationship dynamic. In this video, I'm going to take it a step further and talk about how once you decide that a lot of what you see with conventional relationships is just not healthy, the idea of being in a relationship kind of becomes absurd in many cases. So once you become self-aware about modern relationships, red-pilled so to speak, it's very difficult to go back to wanting to date or find a partner, even if you're not explicitly trying to forbid yourself from doing that, or your position isn't that, well, I know I'll never have a girlfriend, I know I'll never go out on a date again. The whole idea of going through that process, even if you don't forbid yourself from engaging in that, becomes so absurd in many cases that you'd never really consider going through that anyway. You look more at what people actually have to offer and how a relationship is likely to go, and you just decide that you're not really that interested, even if you're not actually telling yourself that you'll never do that again. So, although it's still possible to find something positive in a member of the opposite sex, it becomes an absurdity to try to live out a conventional type of relationship once you know it is typically a fruitless endeavor, especially in the long run, and especially if you make any sort of commitment toward that. It just becomes ridiculous to even consider trying to partner up with someone for an extended period of time unless it works for that period of time. But in terms of actually planning your whole life out with that person, it just becomes a ridiculous idea once you see how men and women really react in relationships and how dysfunctional the dynamic between men and women tends to be today. Once you're aware, especially from a guy's point of view, which is where I'm coming at this from, right? Your average straight guy who's basically not anything unusual or basically is not in the top 5 or 10% of men. Maybe you're not in the bottom 5 or 10% of men, but you're just a guy that's somewhere in the middle of all that. Once you're aware that this game of dating and relationships today in this modern world is rigged against you, it's very likely that you'll be unmotivated to play this game, greatly reducing your willingness to participate in modern day relationships. Even when considering something outside of traditional or conventional relationships, the whole dating and mating game becomes almost absurd to watch at times once you're aware of the dynamic that's at play. Once you're aware of certain aspects of male and female nature, you're aware of the laws, you're aware of what the culture thinks about men and women and how you have this situation where men need to be traditional, but women can just do whatever the hell they want, and it's always the man's fault, and she can do all the things that you can do, but at the same time, you need to prove yourself to her. She's special, but you're equal. And if she decides to just take half your stuff in a divorce, that's okay too. Once you figure out that that's where things stand in most relationships, if they lead to marriage or children today, you're not going to be as motivated to play that game if you're a guy. And again, I talked about that in my previous video, but really I'm trying to focus on the idea or the understanding that whatever is left outside of that just becomes very ridiculous and absurd. Not in all cases, but in many cases. For example, what is left over if you've basically decided that you're not going to be a family man? What is left to actually work with? You've got your single mom that's promiscuous and is also looking for a good man to settle down with, supposedly at the same time. You've got the girls that maybe they haven't had a kid, but they're still going out and they've had a whole bunch of different guys that they've given it away to for free, basically. But then they also want someone to settle down with now. In other words, you're supposed to pay for what so many other men got for free. You've got the women that are on medications, that are depressed or have a lot of anxiety, which is basically going to be something that you have to fight with constantly if you're going to date that type of woman. You've got the women out there that think that they're strong and independent and don't need no man, and they try to act like the alpha, and they try to act like you owe them something because of the patriarchy and stuff like that. But then they're still straight, and they still expect men to date them, and they think that their physical beauty is enough to basically carry them through and find a decent to good man. And that's what's available, right? You can go on with different examples. You could talk about the woman that wants to be the trad wife, that doesn't want to try to be the alpha in the relationship, but just expects a man to be a provider and protector, even though if you're aware of where that stands and the common consequences of that, you realize that you're just as likely to see her divorcing you and taking half of your stuff. Or in fact, if she only works part-time or she's a stay-at-home mom, the divorce courts are going to actually give her more of an advantage than if she also worked full-time and made almost as much of an income as you. And then you have those women as well, the women that are high earners that expect men to basically be at or above their level even though they're making six figures. This is what you have available to you, and this is considering that you're not going to get married or have kids. A lot of these women are just not going to want to date a man that has that position if you're clear about that from the beginning. But even for the women that would still date you and would just want to see where things go, so to speak, what's the point? It becomes absurd. It becomes ridiculous in most cases. And so once you're no longer part of the game and you look at relationships how they are today, typically speaking, you realize that a lot of it is just not really worthwhile, right? It goes back to a saying that you hear in the men's community a lot, that the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And this is just kind of a specific way of saying that in one sense. But I've noticed how absurd so many of the things that are available for men today to try to chase after have become. You see all this social media stuff that you have to compete with. You see all these things that are not at all to your advantage, and yet society and a lot of women just expect men to still be interested in dating them. And this is not meant to be mean toward any particular group of women. It just is what it is. There's really not much that's beneficial that's there for men today, that's actually available. In many cases, it's not so much that taking the red pill prohibits a man from pursuing anything with a woman. You have men that are in monk mode. You have men that take the idea of going their own way to the point that they're not going to date or have sexual relations with women. And I don't have any problem with those guys. But for most men that have what you could call red pill awareness, it's not a matter of prohibiting any sort of action with a woman other than you probably don't want to get married, you probably don't want to get a woman pregnant. But it's more a matter of that the remaining options are so clearly ridiculous that it isn't worth jumping through hoops or applying any sort of serious effort to try to cultivate such a relationship with so many of these women that are out here. And again, it's not to say that they're all ruined to the point where you couldn't be friends with some of them or that they're all horrible people. A lot of women today are of low quality. There are a number of men that are of low quality as well today. I get that. But even looking at the women that may be halfway decent or better people, there's just not much there that they'd really offer you that would really get you to want to date them. Unless there is a low effort and minimal risk type of situation that presents itself, the majority of men who are red-pilled about relationships will simply choose not to participate in relationships in most cases. It's not a matter of saying, well, we swear off women forever. You see these articles, these hit pieces made about the men's community and men going their own way from time to time, or at least in the past we've seen this, where they try to say that, well, we all hate women, we're all misogynists, or we're swearing off women forever because we think that's the only solution, is to just have nothing to do with women at all. Or we're all just a bunch of incels. Or there's a debate about how many of these guys are sent their own way versus going their own way. But really, it's not about any of that in a lot of cases. It's just about looking around you and looking at what's available outside of trying to build a life with a woman. Once you have given up on that as an idea for whatever reason, any reason that led to that conclusion that I'm not going to get married or have kids or try to be a family man, I'm not going to build my life with a woman because there's too much risk, or maybe women don't like me enough to do that. It doesn't matter, right? You don't have the resources to attract a woman to want that with you, right? You're not economically attractive, so to speak, even if you're halfway decent looking. Regardless of how you got to that point, once you realize that you're not part of the game, you're not looking for a particular woman to build a life with, what's left over becomes such an absurdity that there's just no reason to date. It's not that you prohibit yourself from dating, it's just that there's very little to nothing there around you that's worthwhile. Again, as is often said, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. And the whole idea of dating or being in a relationship with most of the women that you find around you today, especially if you live in Western society, it just becomes so absurd to try to approach that. And then you can add in Me Too, and you can add in the idea that you're going to be accused of sexual harassment, whether it's at the workplace or on the street or anywhere else, just because you ask a woman for her number, right? You add in these potential risks and these potential negative things that can happen to you with the idea that what do you have that you're trying to achieve? You've got the single mom that's already banged every guy in town. You've got women that maybe they haven't had a child, maybe they've had an abortion. Maybe they're going to be mentally and emotionally messed up because of that reproductive choice, if you want to call it that. You've got women out there that, again, they think that they're the girl boss and that they need to be in charge if you're going to date her or be in a relationship with her. And yet they're still going to expect you to pay for dinner. They're still going to expect you to treat her special, even though she wants the authority in the relationship, if she would have a boyfriend. It's just not worth it. And I'm sure you guys can come up with plenty of other examples of women out there that it's just like, I don't want to deal with this crap. There's no reason to. It's just absurd to try to date or be in a relationship unless it's easy. And it's something that, hey, I met this girl, we were friends, she had my back at different points in life when I went through certain situations, and we get along well, we actually have common interests, which in itself is rare between men and women, and we just decided that we were going to have a relationship, and it's going to last as long as it lasts. I'm going to make sure I don't get her pregnant. I'm not going to commit to anything with her. We're not going to live together, but it just is what it is for as long as it is. That sort of makes sense to me still for the guys that aren't choosing more or less the monk path. But anything beyond that, anything that isn't just easy, or if you're a guy that women find attractive and you're protecting yourself and you choose to basically hook up, right, because it's easy for you, I get that. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but I do understand that. It makes sense. But anything beyond that that requires effort, why? Once you have realized what conventional relationships are, and you've realized things about female nature that are not pleasant in terms of how they apply to you as a man or to the men around them, because of the state giving women power to just basically act on their nature with impunity. You realize that women today can kind of get away with almost anything and just make stuff up. You're not going to get married, most likely. You're not going to have kids. But beyond that, what is left? What is left over just becomes an absurdity. And so I've noticed that more recently. As, like I've mentioned, I no longer see myself as part of the game. I'm not interested in finding someone. But even in terms of what's left outside of that, once you're no longer looking, a lot of the stuff that we see, I think, or at least from my experience and point of view, just becomes absurd. It just becomes something that's not worth dealing with. So let me know what you guys think. I just think that that's the more common reason for why red-pilled men give up on dating. It's not that they prohibit themselves from finding a girlfriend or going out with a woman and spending time with her or basically getting laid. It's not that these men are prohibiting themselves from doing that. It's that there's just not much value there. It's just not a worthwhile thing. The risks, the rewards, the pain in the ass, there's just not much that actually motivates us once we really accept where things are between men and women today to want to go out and do these things. It's not a matter of saying we can't do it or we forbid ourselves from doing it because we know that it's all bad. It's just that there's not much there that's positive. And I just want to know whether you guys have had similar experiences or thought processes, whether this is the way that you see things as well. But it's not so much that red pill men are unwilling to date in a lot of cases. Some of them have chosen the path of not engaging in that process. Some men are just totally over it. But it's a matter of what's actually out there, especially once you've given up on the idea of building a life with a woman or starting a family. Most of what's out there is just so ridiculous and not worth participating in that I think it becomes an absurdity to even want to go through that process.